Welcome back. As we pick up our narrative with Paul, when last we left Paul, he was under house arrest in Rome, awaiting his trial before the Roman Supreme Court. And at that point, the book of Acts ends. It says Paul stayed in Rome, and he preached, and he taught boldly and without hindrance, but it doesn't tell us anything else. We know that while he was there, he continued to write letters. We assume he wrote lots of letters. What we do know is 5 specifically. Paul wrote letters to the Philippians. You'll remember back on one of his journeys, he started a church in the city of Philippi. He wrote a letter to a man named Philemon. He wrote a letter to the church in Galatia. He wrote a letter to the Ephesians. And we're told he wrote a letter to the Laodiceans. Now, we do not have that letter. That letter has been lost in history. It's not in the Bible. It's not anywhere. We know that he wrote the letter because in Colossians chapter 4, Paul says, I need you to read the letter I sent to the Laodiceans. So we know that Paul wrote a letter. We just don't have a copy of that letter. Presumably, it says many of the same things as the letters we're going to look at today. Well, at the base of these letters, or at least Philemon, Colossians, and Ephesians, is a man by the name of Onesimus. In the first century Roman Empire, slavery was legal. It was normal. History tells us that there were probably more slaves in the empire than there were Roman citizens. And typically, slaves were treated quite poorly. They were not considered human as much as they were considered property. And there was a young slave by the name of Onesimus that ran away. He ran away from his owner, a Christian by the name of Philemon, who lived in Colossae. Somehow, as this whole thing begins, Onesimus, the runaway slave, found his way to Rome, where again, somehow, in God's design, he encountered Paul. We don't know how he got there. We don't know how he encountered Paul. What we do know is that he became very close to Paul. Paul at one point refers to Onesimus as his son. Whether that means Paul led him to Christ, or whether that simply means Paul loved him like a son, Onesimus was very dear to Paul. And it was the presence of Onesimus that spurred the writing of 3 of the letters we're looking at. Under Roman law, Onesimus must be sent back to his owner Philemon. And there was no appeal, there was no way around it. That's the way the law worked in the Roman Empire. So Paul had Onesimus travel back to his owner, knowing that the law would allow severe punishment, even the execution of a runaway slave. So this is kind of a tricky situation for Paul and for Onesimus and for everybody else involved. So Paul wrote a letter to his friend Philemon. The letter is warm, it's not very long, but it's personable, it's encouraging, and in the letter Paul says, Philemon, my friend, I want you to welcome Onesimus back. And he says, keep in mind that Onesimus is a fellow believer. So interestingly in this letter, Paul does not condemn slavery. There's nowhere that he supports it, but he did not take this opportunity to call slavery evil or anything like that. What he did do was took the opportunity to reframe the way Philemon and others are thinking about slavery. So he said, Philemon, I need you to remember that while Onesimus is legally your slave, he is a brother in Christ, and you need to welcome him back as a brother in Christ. In fact, if you have lost anything financially because of Onesimus, I will personally reimburse you for your financial loss. Now, one of the things that we don't normally think of in the 21st century is that letters like this are both private. This was a letter from Paul to Philemon, and they're public. This letter would have been read to the people who were in Philemon's home. And Philemon had a church that met in his home. So everything that Paul wrote to Philemon would have been read to this house church, which adds again another interesting, now Philemon is going to have to be one of those Christian leaders in the first century who starts thinking about what does slavery truly mean and how does he interact with Onesimus. Well, at the same time that Paul sent this letter to Philemon, he sent a letter to the Colossians. Philemon lived in the city of Colossae. So the letter to Philemon is pretty specific. It's about Onesimus. The letter to the Colossians, the city in which they're living, is a little bit more general. It mentions Onesimus. It's not a large city, so people would have known that Philemon, who could be considered a pastor probably, Pastor Philemon, now was dealing with a runaway slave who was a believer. What do you do? So the issue is mentioned in the book of Colossians, but the letter is more general. It starts to talk a little bit about the situation in Colossae. Well, Colossae is a city in the province of Asia. The capital of Asia is Ephesus. So Paul writes a letter to Philemon, he writes a letter to Colossians, and he writes a letter to the Ephesians. And he sends all of three of these letters with Onesimus, who is also accompanied by a friend of Paul's named Tychicus. Ephesians is more general yet. Where Philemon is specific, it talks about slavery. Colossians is a little bit more general. It mentions slavery, but then goes on to talk about some doctrinal issues. The letter to the Ephesians is more general still. It doesn't really talk much about slavery. It mentions it in passing. What it does address is some false teaching that was beginning to crop up in the province of Asia. Specifically, this false teaching, this heresy is a word that just means false teaching, was a loose collection of thinking. It was not yet a religion. It was not a coordinated set of thoughts with leaders and things like that. It later became known as the religion called Gnosticism. It was made up, really, at this point in history, of three different trains of thought, three different ways of doing religion and believing in gods and philosophy. The first was something called Zoroastrianism, named after Zoroaster, who developed this complex set of religious beliefs. The second train of thought was Hellenism. We've talked about that in previous classes, Greek philosophy. That also played into what was going on. And then the third piece of this was Judaism, the Jewish faith with the Jewish scriptures. All three of those things, Zoroastrianism, Hellenism, and Judaism, were starting to come together in the first century in the province of Asia into a new set of false teaching. So these letters address for the Colossians and for the Ephesians what is going on with this new teaching. And in our next session, we'll break that down and we'll start to look at specifically what was being taught.